It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Roger Schonfeld. Roger is a director of Ithaka's S&R Libraries and Scholarly Communication Program. He leads strategic consulting, surveys, and other research projects for academic libraries, scholarly publishers, content platforms, and learned societies. Recently, his team has developed innovative surveys and ethnographic research projects to better understand and serve research, teaching, and learning needs, including information discovery and usage, data services, and a variety of other topics. He has also led research and consulting projects for publishers and content providers on ebook publishing, book selling, usage analytics, and discovery systems and discoverability, and for libraries on collection, preservation, assessment, organization structure, and research support services. Roger is a chef of the Scholarly Kitchen blog and an ARL Leadership Fellow. Please welcome Roger.
Hi, everybody. Thanks in advance for bearing with me through the after lunch slot. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm going to try not to spill the coffee. And what I thought I would do is just give a quick introduction to myself and my organization, since some of you may not be as familiar with some of our work. And then what I want to really focus on today is a talk on the research library for an audience of, mostly of publishers and scientists. So I hope you'll think through the next 45 minutes or so about what some of the things are from the research library's transformation that matter to you, and what the role of the society and the publisher and the content provider is in thinking about the stability, health, and success of the research library. So just to give a quick word or two of background to situate who I am and where I'm coming from, I work for an organization called Ithaka, which offers the three services, JSTOR, Portico, and Ithaka S&R. Probably some of you are familiar with JSTOR. It's a content platform. It's a research library. Portico is a digital preservation service, and then Ithaka S&R is our strategic consulting and research service. We're doing work in two different areas, and I'll just say this really briefly. But all of the work on libraries and publishing and scholarly communications that we'll be talking about today, that we have been talking about today, and that really captures the attention and days of probably almost everyone in this room, we have a second, and that's the work that I focus on, but we have a second program area, which if anything is the more interesting program area, which focuses on what we call educational transformation. And for those of you who are in a university, maybe in a public university setting, you're probably really well familiar with the ways that state support for higher education has been declining in just about every state in the country. Some of the pressures to try to educate more students using less resources, and to do so without sacrificing learning outcomes. And we're doing a lot of work to think about how universities and to help universities transform the educational side of their offerings, which in the American Research University is absolutely essentially bundled together with the way that research gets conducted academically in this country. So, we see these things as really closely connected, integrated, and important to think about together. Now, inside of our Libraries and Scholarly Communication program, we're doing work in a couple of areas, as Tim mentioned, focusing on monographs and books. So that's probably of less interest to a lot of you here. But a lot of work on research, teaching, and information usage patterns. And I'm going to be sharing some of our findings from a whole bunch of different studies as part of the talk that I have for you today. We're also doing a lot of work on access impediments. Why can't people get access to the things that they've licensed from publishers? What are the impediments that are blocking their way? And we're doing a lot of work to try to understand, diagnose, and ultimately help to correct for some of these impediments. We're also doing a number of interesting projects on equity and diversity and inclusiveness, looking at organizations like museums and cultural organizations and academic libraries, and really trying to think in a rich way about how we transform our personnel and our inclusiveness and our equity practices for today's society. And then finally, a lot of work on library leadership. So anyway, all of that is just to say that, that today I'm going to try to organize my thinking around the digital transformation of the research library with a strong emphasis on the American Research Library. I'm going to talk about three things fundamentally. I'm going to talk about a format transformation that everyone is familiar with in one sense, the print-to-digital transformation. I'm going to talk about the systems transformation, which is probably one that you're not as familiar with, at least I suspect many would not be as familiar with, which is a real shift that's going on, or should be going on, away from managing collections and towards facilitating research and learning workflows. And then finally, I think it's important to recognize that there's a role transformation taking place for the research library, away from this content provision role and towards facilitating outcomes, learning outcomes and research outcomes. And it's not to say that libraries aren't providing any content anymore, not at all, but the share of their bandwidth and attention is undergoing a shift. And I'll try to leave plenty of time for discussion because ultimately, as I said before, I really want to hear from you about what here resonates with the way that you're seeing the world and what impacts the research library has for your own thinking. So it can be hard to recognize that the sector that you work in has been transformed, and that's really a kind of fundamental principle that I want to hold on to. And you all have been in a sector that's been transformed over the last 2 decades as well in so many ways. But it's hard to see sometimes the bigger picture for the day-to-day roles and responsibilities and work that we have. The press of the day-to-day tasks just doesn't let up, but at the same time, customer behaviors are changing steadily, budgets are increasingly impacted, and ultimately the strategic context is shifting. And so today, research libraries are in the middle of this this digital transformation, and I would like to argue that they're further along the path towards being digital enterprises than we sometimes recognize, but at the same time they face some very real constraints on their ability to fully embrace the digital future. And this essential tension is one that I think that we need as a sector to grapple with. So I want to talk first about this format transition because it's clear to you all, I'm sure, that journals publishing has shifted to digital, right? I'm not going to convince anyone that there's any news there that I'll share today. But there's a lot more evidence for the way that the research library has been transformed from print to digital that I think is important to talk through for just a few minutes to build a common formulation here. So I would argue that budgets are an essential way to understand the priorities and operations of just about any organization, the strategy of just about any organization. And academic libraries' budgets have been completely transformed. This is from a survey that we did a few years ago of library directors. So this is actually 2.5 years outdated. But at that point, you can see here the red bar are the doctoral institutions, the research institutions. You can see at that time they thought that 70% of their materials budgets were going towards e-journals and journal databases, and another 10% or so going to e-books. So you can see that the share of the materials budgets that have flipped from traditional formats to digital resources is simply overwhelming. It's actually moved a fair bit faster than they expected. So here you'll see in the blue bars what the estimates were in 2010. In the green bars, in 2010, what they thought the future would look like 5 years from then. And then in 2013, in the getting confused here. So anyway, so the point. Let me just say the point of this slide, which is that the estimates outpace the reality in terms of the digital transformation for library budgets, and I expect will continue to do so going forward. Scholars are telling us, you all know this, are telling us how much they love e-journals in many cases. So this is the share, this is findings that were just released a few weeks ago. This is the share of U.S. faculty members that say that if my library canceled the current issues of a print version of a journal but continued to make them available electronically, that would be fine with me. Well, that's already happened in so many cases, so this is the last time we'll even bother doing the measurement, but you can see levels of strong agreement with that statement in the 70 and 80% range for science and medicine faculty, and even among humanists, it's above 50% that agree strongly. Perhaps more interestingly for some of you, this is the share that agrees strongly that I am completely comfortable with journals that I access regularly, that I use regularly, ceasing their print versions and publishing in electronic only form. So this is saying not only my library doesn't need to collect it, but guys, just don't bother issuing the print anymore, right? And perhaps some of you have already taken those kinds of steps. I'm hearing more and more of that kind of activity. You can see that the scientists and medical faculty respondents are in the 60 to 70% range, agreeing strongly with that statement. Even humanists now, we have 40% of those agreeing strongly with that statement. It's not growing, it's not growing up to 100%, at least not yet. But you can see the steady directionality there. Now, I'd like to take a minute to recognize that as a result of the changes in the business models to distribute scholarly content, there have been two important changes that have taken place. One is that there's been a vastly expanded, this is probably the one that's talked about much less, there's been a vastly expanded set of content that's available to researchers at almost every institution. And I had to clip this from a PDF. I couldn't find the original file, but this was from a study that we did in 2004 and 2005, looking at the time at the number of journal titles that each of these institutions subscribe to. So on the left are 4 institutions, small colleges in the United States: Bryn Mawr, Franklin and Marshall, Suffolk, and Williams College. In the middle are some medium-sized libraries like Drexel and George Mason and Western Carolina University. And then we have some research universities on the right: Cornell, NYU, Pittsburgh, and Yale. And the key thing to see here is that every single one of these institutions, with the exception of Yale, had more electronic journals than they had print journals at a time before anyone had really stopped canceling print versions. And so the expansion of access through the bundled way that access has been sold and through other changes in the distribution of scholarly content has really been substantial. And I think this is something that doesn't get enough attention in conversations about changes to the scholarly communications and research institution landscape over the course of time. Now, at the same time, so this obviously matters to academic scientists, right? I mean, what this has meant is that folks at a school like Williams College, where there are meaningful aspirations, real aspirations to have a scientific research apparatus, actually have access, maybe not to the identical set of content as Yale does, but something getting much closer towards that in digital format. But equally, as I think we all know, as a result of these digital distribution and service models, libraries also have far less flexibility in how they're acquiring content. They have far less flexibility in how they spend their materials budget. I don't think I need to recite to you some of the ways that a combination of universities under-investing in libraries and publishers developing bundled models of content distribution has really come to squeeze out the ability for so many libraries to buy in areas where they ideally would like to be buying. And this has led, as I'm sure you know, to the push for open access, albeit with little, if any, relief to materials budgets at this point. But, so all of this, though, is about acquisitions, right? What are they buying this year? And for you, that's probably a lot of how many publishers will think about the role of a library. But a library actually does so much more than acquisitions, even thinking about its general collections. And so, libraries are responsible for things like preserving our cultural heritage and the scholarly record, and that's not a trivial statement to make, right? And so these grand research libraries and storage facilities that have been built over time, we're surely today under investing as a society in preservation compared with the investments that we made in the past. And I would love to find that that was a topic that you'd like to talk about in the discussion section, because as I see it, publishers have taken a much greater interest in preservation as a result of the shift to digital formats and the investments that they've made in initiatives like Clocks and Portico. So I think that, in some ways there's a good story to tell there, even though there's a series of underinvestments. But because libraries are not just thinking about the current the current acquisitions that they're making, the current year of publishing that is taking place, the current subscription, because they maintain this interest in their collections looking backwards as well, such a profound interest in their collections looking backwards, they think about discovery and access in ways that are I think, very different, right? So they're interested in the discovery and access to those things there, all those bound, whatever they may be, the millions and millions of items that sit in stacks, in off-site storage facilities, and so forth. And so those collections also have been transformed. And this is something that is important to think about when we're thinking about the transformation of the research library. So I'll just use HathiTrust as an example. In case you're not familiar with HathiTrust, this is where the libraries are storing the Google digitized volumes, the volumes that Google and others worked with them to digitize across the research libraries. And these digitization initiatives, as you may know, have digitized millions and millions and millions of books. I don't, probably you can't read the numbers here. I just threw them up from their current website, but they've digitized. They have HathiTrust, which is a collaboration of libraries, is currently storing some 7 million book titles in its digital service, and in some cases with multiple copies or multiple volumes, so they have some 14 million volumes. It's an enormous library. It's as big or bigger than most of the research libraries in the world in terms of the size of the content. And the thing that's important to know about this and to kind of consider is that every single one of those items can be fully searched. The full text of it can be searched. And I'm someone who probably was a little skeptical that mattered very much if you'd asked me a few years ago. But the evidence is just accumulating that, and it's in some ways like some of the talk that you may be more familiar with on the sort of data, folks who are interested in data science and approaches to sort of data mining the literature and using it for new discoveries. In some fields, especially in the humanities, the opportunity to have a full text search of essentially the entire library or large portions of the library has been methodologically transformative and is actually opening up some new vistas in the humanities in ways that are really for historians and others are just incredibly exciting. So these can be so the public domain items here can be fully searched, freely accessed, and readily downloaded by anyone. Unfortunately, or I'll take the value judgment away, but the reality is that only public domain content is widely available through a service like this. So although all of the more recent materials can be searched and used for discovery purposes, they can't actually be accessed. So for some of the historic content, we're in this very strange sort of dual format dynamic where you can discover the full text digitally, but you can't access it digitally. And this is putting research libraries in a really interesting dilemma because actually a lot of the ways that books get used in all fields isn't for reading. And this is probably true of journals too, if you think about it, right? But it's certainly true for monographs. When you have a 300 or 400 page scholarly monograph on some relatively idiosyncratic topic, very typically, the reason why people developed indices to monographs, to books, is precisely because the expectation is not cover-to-cover reading in every case, but is other ways of accessing that content. And so that sort of puts us in a really interesting dilemma, puts our libraries in a really interesting dilemma in terms of their, should they be keeping, in some cases, as you know, millions and millions of volumes of content in the heart of their campus, or should they be thinking about literally emptying the research library and using that space for a completely new set of purposes? These are the kinds of questions that are being asked in the research library community today, and HathiTrust is a good example of the kind of service that's spearheading the thinking about what's possible within the constraints that exist and what isn't. Oh, I know what I wanted to show you. I wanted to show you just a quick, I wanted to show you a demonstration, an indication, an illustration of the way that scholars are thinking about monographs, right? I showed you before that for journals, the format transition has really leapt forward, and you know this already. I didn't have to show you the slides, I'm sure. But for monographs, the use cases are so different. So we asked, this is in the faculty survey that we just issued a few weeks ago, we asked scholars across the United States to think about each of these 6 use cases here and to indicate whether it's easier or harder to do those use cases, to perform those use cases in print or digital form. And it's everything from reading cover to cover in depth to searching for a particular topic in the volume, in the monograph. And here's the kind of quick overview, is that you can see the light blue bars on the left indicate that doing that thing is easier in print, and the dark blue bars all the way on the right indicate that that thing is easier to do digitally. And so you can see that for some things like reading cover to cover in depth, everyone, almost the great majority, think it's easier to do that with a print volume. And there's similar majorities for doing certain of these use cases digitally, such as searching and exploring. And that, I think, is the essence of this dual format conundrum that libraries, research libraries in particular, face today, because they simply can't do what they've done for journal volumes, which is to say, great, let's go all in on digital. But they also clearly can't say, great, let's stick with print, because print is obviously going to be the format of tomorrow, right? It's a dual format environment. This has budgetary implications. This has acquisitions implications. Should you pay for things in both formats? It has systems implications in terms of how do you make these things discoverable and accessible. And and of course it's being done as books account for a smaller and smaller share of library budgets. So there's a lot of challenge in that. So this is I have 3 tensions that I'm going to be talking about today. So my first tension is really that library collections have not seen the same degree of transformation as acquisitions have. But that digitization has transformed discovery for all, and as a result, libraries are really trying to figure out, is there a future that we should try to is there a way that we should try to leapfrog beyond this present conundrum, or do we have to maintain print collections in the heart of campus for the foreseeable future? This is a real question, and it's not a small question in terms of what belongs in the library building. You might think, oh, well, that's just kind of a facilities question in terms of what belongs in the library building. But in the way that universities work, the question of what is the identity of that library is still, perhaps in too many cases, is still very much caught up inside of the facility and inside of the building. And the buildings have become increasingly identified with the humanities, given that so many of the science libraries have reduced their footprints, in some cases have closed down their physical locations altogether. And so there are really significant political implications for the academic library associated with what should we do with this facility. The collections are one piece of that puzzle, and I'll come a little later to some of the other pieces of that puzzle. So I want to turn now to the second of these transformations that I'm organizing the talk around, which is this shift away from managing collections and towards using collections as one piece of how libraries are helping to facilitate workflows. And when I say workflows, we could think about a variety of different kinds of work practices that a researcher, a faculty member, or a student might want to take on. It could be the way that a researcher is discovering information and wants to get from the process of content discovery or resource discovery all the way towards accessing a journal article. But it could be a variety of other kinds of use cases associated with publishing, associated with data deposit, associated with taking a course and doing the course readings. So whatever those workflows are, the libraries are increasingly turning their attention not just towards let's bring the content into the building and keep track of it and manage it and preserve it, but thinking about that as part of the user experience, I think, is probably a good way to put it. So the implications here of how collections are managed are really profound. This is really this is a. I'm going to get into the weeds here a little bit, but I want to draw a couple of connections that may make sense to may help to frame this for you. So publishers, I'm sure many of you are familiar and probably use extensively and actually have a lot more knowledge of than I do. The kind of internal systems for like manuscript submission and tracking and peer review and so forth. So I think this is the Aries workflow tool or whatnot. This is an example of a system that's at the heart. You'll immediately understand. This is at the heart of what you can do, right, internally, how you organize your work. It empowers you in some ways, probably constrains you in a lot of others. It has certain forms of flexibility, probably certain limitations. I have no idea with these kinds of tools myself. But similarly, libraries have internal systems also. And these internal systems for libraries are just as vitally important, maybe more vitally important than some of the internal systems that publishers use. The library systems do things like budget management and content management and increasingly discovery and access. And so this is obviously an ancient system. But curiously, in the screenshot that I was able to find on Google, you'll see it says June 2013 on the upper left. So I don't actually know if this system, it's clearly from the 80s, I think, but it maybe still is in use in some places, which we won't go there. So originally libraries developed. I won't take your time with the whole history, though. I'm absolutely fascinated by the way that libraries originally developed standalone systems for things like cataloging and acquisitions and serials management and so forth. And then these were a godsend because you think about a research library that acquires tens of thousands of books a year, has tens of thousands of subscriptions, has millions of volumes sitting in the stacks, circulates probably hundreds of thousands of volumes a year. The ability to automate that and not do it manually, that was transformative, right? That was a really important transformation. And then over time, these different systems became more integrated with one another, and that was great. But the system was digital, right? These systems were digital, but the libraries were still managing print resources, right? They hadn't shifted. There hadn't been a shift towards digital publishing. It was that they had digital systems for managing print collections, essentially. Now, as formats have shifted to digital, these systems, they don't work anymore. In very profound ways, they don't do the things that libraries need to do to manage e-resources, where the idea that a single title is the unit that you purchased doesn't make any sense today with journal subscriptions, right? So you're purchasing a bundle of journals, but you want to catalog individual titles, but you want to discover individual articles, and in a very profound way, these systems don't work in the ways that they need to. So additional kinds of systems have been bolted on to these to these library systems over have been called these library systems over time. So now we have e-resources management tools, and now we have discovery services that are designed to make it possible to discover articles and not just the titles of books and journals, and all sorts of systems to help authorize access to content, which is something that I'll say a little bit more about in a minute. To say that this patchwork of different systems has been a challenge is an understatement, a profound understatement. When these library systems aren't working right, and they are not working right, researchers can't find the knowledge that they're seeking all too often. And once they find that research, they all too often can't access it, even though their library has licensed the content. Okay, so that's really what I want to try to emphasize, is that this should matter to you, not because you care about the inner workings of libraries, but because the way that the systems environment is set up is impeding the ability of researchers all too often to access the articles, the journals, the books that you are publishing, and which perhaps in some cases, the amount of access matters not just intellectually, but also from a business perspective. I've been talking quite a bit over the last year and doing research over the last year about some of the dead ends that this dynamic is producing. So you start your research, for example, off campus, and it is profoundly easy to just be locked out of the e-resources. And by off campus, we might mean a professor who is working at home today, or visiting another colleague in a lab somewhere, or traveling to a conference like we are today. The dead ends that we've created all over the place, and these, by the way, get created not just as a result of flaws in library systems. I want to make sure that this is heard clearly. There are profound flaws in the hosting platforms that some of us are using, that also are producing these kinds of dead ends. If you're, for example, on a mobile phone, or if you are working off campus. So this is not a pretty picture, and it's not a pretty picture because of something that anyone has done intentionally. It's not because we aren't all trying to do great work with our hosting platforms and with our library systems and but we are increasingly needing to be mindful of these workflows and not just of the content. And that's true for publishers as well. I certainly would argue. So luckily, there is some progress at hand, and so it's not all bad story. We're all constantly redesigning our platforms and rethinking our systems, and so there's a lot of good things that are happening. I want to focus on the library side of this. So one of the bits of good news is that there is a very rapid transition happening now towards next generation library systems. And this is good news on several fronts. It's good news because these systems are integrating the way that we manage and discover print and electronic resources together for the first time. So this is actually incredibly important, that we don't have a print library here and a digital library here, or sometimes a library of books here and a library of journal articles here, but we actually are starting to provide researchers a view into the collective whole. And secondly, there are going to be some meaningful efficiencies that get found as a result, first because of that internal transformation, but also because libraries are increasingly going to be running these systems on a collaborative basis at the level of, for example, the California State University system, where they are going to be using these systems as ways to demand or provide different ways of buying and accessing content, both the print and on the digital side together. They also there are also some warning signs, and I don't know how many of these will be so interesting to you, but I think they're important to bear in mind, which is that there's actually only one vendor that is providing the library systems platform that the great majority of research libraries appear to be turning to right now. So you can immediately understand the risk and some of the marketplace dynamics that poses for libraries, and I think for the ecosystem more broadly. But actually, the bigger problem is that even these next generation systems are still organized around the idea of the library as the organizing principle and not the user. And this is a really fundamental distinction. So the way that we think about who's at the center of almost any systems design is a really profound question. And so what this means is that these systems have not, for example, thought about users who actually are affiliated with multiple institutions at the same time. Many users increasingly are affiliated with multiple universities, or with a university and a public library, or are an alumni here and a researcher there, or what have you. So they haven't really been designed with the user at their heart. And ultimately, they haven't figured out how to facilitate access in a way that goes beyond the IP authentication model, which I am coming to believe is hobbling a lot of our ability to really think about the user as a fully portable, mobile individual, the researcher as a mobile individual who wants not only to have access wherever they may be, but also increasingly is looking to be able to discover content not just by doing a search in a search box, but by keeping up with the current literature in really exciting ways that make discovery what it really should be for scientific research. So my own view is that users need a single account, a single user account that provides for their affiliations, that provides for the right appropriate copy of an item for them, that authorizes their access to content, and that personalizes their user experience, including discovery. So I think we'll see, this is just my own view, but it seems to me that this is an aspirational direction that we should be working towards. So I guess the kind of essential point that I really want to call to your attention here, the tension, is that this generational shift in systems that libraries are investing, and I say generational because this is like a once every 10 or 15 or 20 year transition for libraries. Okay, so they're going to make a transition now, and these transitions sometimes have taken years to plan and execute as a publisher transitioning to a new hosting platform. And this generational shift is not providing a discovery and access experience that empowers individual users, researchers, in a way that meets the expectations that we all have that are set by our online consumer experience with folks like Amazon and Google and Facebook. So I think that there are some good points to this story, but it's not a totally happy one. Now, the last transformation, and in some ways the most important and exciting one, is the distinction, the shift, the transformation from providing content to facilitating outcomes. And here, what I want to really emphasize is that libraries have been historically thought of as acquiring and buying resources and storing them and preserving them. But in fact, there's now so much of a turn towards accountability in higher education for all sorts of reasons that I'd be happy to talk further about. That we are now, certainly among libraries, but really across the higher education apparatus, turning towards measuring and assessing outcomes and figuring out whether we're facilitating the right ones. So there are a couple of bits that are kind of changing. One is that libraries aren't selecting content nearly as much as they once did. So the idea that there were bibliographers or selectors for chemistry and anthropology and art history and so forth, that idea is falling by the wayside. Journals are now licensed through bundles rather than selected at a title level to a very large extent. Books are now bought through systems where you just profile, give me all of the books published by university presses in the field of art history, and they just arrive in boxes and you don't have to pay any attention. Or give me only the ones appropriate for teaching undergraduates. We don't have a research program in that field. So title level selection of books has drawn down to a great degree. And then open access resources, of course, if they're selected in very different ways and for very different purposes than subscribed or bought content would be. So, so those roles are really changing, and the idea that any library is really building a general collection that is special. That idea is starting to, I don't want to say it's disappearing, but it is certainly coming under some scrutiny. So, so some people are really interested in saying, okay, well, we've got general collections. Maybe those are declining in kind of specialness in one sense. So let's think about the things that are not general collections. Let's think about the distinctive collections, the rare materials, the archives, the international and area studies collections. Probably the best articulation of this view is from Rick Anderson, who some of you may know from the University of Utah, who's, I think, written really eloquently about some of the opportunities to think about a shift in emphasis away from general and towards distinctive collections. How do we build them? How do we unlock them? How do we celebrate them? How do we reorganize the very nature of the library to make all of that possible? I think others probably I fall a little bit more on this side of the spectrum, are a little bit more interested in developing library services, and so thinking about the way that thinking about that shift. So trying to understand, for example, how are research practices changing? Right? They are changing in profound ways from field after field after field after field. So what we've been doing, what my colleagues and I at Ithaka SNR have been doing, is deep qualitative examinations on a field or discipline level of the research practices of scholars, working in partnership with scholarly societies, working in partnership with 15 or 20 universities that have a strength in that particular field, and conducting interviews with 100 or more scholars in the newer fields that we've been studying, with the conviction that new opportunities to serve the information workflow and sort of workflow and information needs of scholars will surely arise. We've done these in fields like art history. I would love to take the time to get into each one of these, but I think I have a little bit more of a science focused audience. So I'll just say we've done really cool research in the fields of art history and history as well, where the very nature of how discovery and archival work and personal collections and it's all changing, and it's in really exciting and interesting ways. But I'll focus a little more on chemistry, because this might speak a little bit more to some of your the fields that you work with. So in chemistry, one of the key findings of our study in this field was that any effort to emphasize the need of the individual chemist was very often losing sight of the fact that almost all chemistry research takes place in the context of a laboratory group, right? And so the idea that, oh, I'm going to provide service to this PhD student or to this postdoc or to this PI, it just wasn't really it didn't get at the nature of the way that collaborations work. We had a conversation yesterday about the fact that now there's even, cross lab and cross institutional team science taking place, and I won't even get into that, but certainly the idea of thinking about how to serve more than just individuals, and what all of the infrastructure and workflows and services would look like is a really important question. How do you provide current awareness, not just to the individual chemist, but to the members of a team, of a laboratory team? How do you manage data inside of a laboratory? Not with the idea of depositing data for reuse and storage. That's what the thought leaders all think is really important. But the working chemists, we're struggling with. I've got data in 16 different formats from 25 different instruments that are located in 2 different continents, and I just need to pull these all together to do the analysis that I'm conducting here. And then finally, they told us, I don't care about open access. You know, if you make me do it, I'll do it, but I don't care about open access. I want you to help me, you being whoever the you might be. I want you to help me publish in a way that will make me more likely to receive funding in the next funding cycle. And so how could you optimize the library scholarly communications efforts, or the journal's publishing program, or the altmetrics, or the whatever, to optimize for that outcome? That would be a chemist-centric way of conducting scholarly communications. So anyway, you know, as you can see, lots of possible service opportunities in that, whether for a library, for a publisher, for a learned society, for, you know, a startup, et cetera. We're in the process of doing these studies with a bunch more fields. If any of these fields are super exciting to you, or you feel that there's another field that we should be thinking about, that you're passionate about, please talk to me about it, because we're really ramping up this program. It's a very, very exciting collaboration to figure out how to develop the services, not just that libraries can offer, but potentially that libraries and publishers and other intermediaries can partner on in a variety of ways. And then I want to just say one thing quickly, and then I'll close. We are the other bit of this transformation towards outcomes is a profound transformation in support of student success that is happening at university after university, in state after state, in some cases with a little bit of a negative dynamic to it. Why don't your alums in this program earn the same salary that university's alums in that other program earn? I mean, there's a lot of scrutiny in some states at that level of this major is not having the right salary outcomes. But there's also some really good sides to this, which are that universities are starting to wake up to the fact that some of their that when you have a 6-year undergraduate graduation rate that's 30 or 40 or 50%, that something is profoundly wrong with the way education is being delivered. And so there's real interest in rethinking. This tracks back to the educational transformation work that Ithaka SNR is doing. So we asked faculty members, this is again in the faculty survey that we just completed, we asked them how important it is that their library provides a variety of different forms of service or support. And I'll just say quickly, we have the gateway, the buyer, and the archive. These are, you know, the discovery, the licensing, and the sort of cataloging and preservation side of things. And then we asked them about teaching support and research support and undergraduate learning support. And, you know, the picture overall, looking up to 2012, was that the buyer role every single cycle was the most important one. Spend money to get us access to the resources that we need to do our work, right? That's the buyer role in a nutshell. And I won't get into some of the other dynamics that have shifted, but what I want to show you here is that all of these bars have been going up from year to year, from 2012 to 2015, but the really exciting one is that supporting the outcomes, supporting undergraduates, supporting learning outcomes has popped up from less than 60% of respondents telling us that that was very important to them in 2012 to nearly 80% saying the same thing in 2015. In fall 2015. And that is one of a number of bits of evidence from our survey and elsewhere that convinces me that these messages about student success that have been in the legislatures and have been in the think tanks and have been in the scholarly discourse about higher education have really begun to make an impact on scientists and humanists writ large. So I'm gonna sort of skip over one or two things there. We'll post the full slide deck. But the kind of third tension that I really want to help us think through is that although content remains very much at the heart of what it is that libraries do, there's no way out of that. Libraries are looking beyond their general collections for how they're going to add value, and I see a lot of interesting potential for publishers to move. Learned societies to move in some of those directions too, especially as we think even beyond research to teaching and learning and what it means to help with student success and not just providing content for the classroom. So that's maybe a little too preachy for what I was intending, but I do hope that you'll be open to thinking creatively about some of those things as well. So I talked about 3 sources of tension, 3 transformations, and 3 which are each a source of tension. The format transformation, the systems transformation as we're moving towards workflows, and then this role transformation towards services and outcomes, learning outcomes, research outcomes. And I hope that you can see that libraries are have challenges. There's no doubt about it, but there's also a tremendous amount of potential in each of these 3. In each of these 3 transformations. So what I'll leave you with I'll be happy to answer questions, but I'll also leave you with a question or 2. One of which is, what do publishers need from libraries in libraries' digital transformation? So what do you need them to be thinking about to make this set of transformations work well for you? And also, what can publishers, how can publishers strengthen libraries as the libraries are grappling with some of these transformations as well? So that's, I would really be interested in hearing your thoughts on either of those questions, or for that matter, anything else you'd like to talk about. Thank you.